Imagine standing naked before a crowd of your neighbors while strangers probe every inch of your body with sharpened needles, searching for a mark that proves you made a pact with the devil. Imagine being bound and thrown into freezing water, where floating means death by burning and sinking means drowning before anyone pulls you up. Imagine being kept awake for 7 days straight until your mind fractures, and you confess to crimes you never committed, to flying on broomsticks and dancing with demons, just to make the torture stop. This was the reality for tens of thousands of women across Europe and the Americas between the 15th and 18th centuries. History whispers to us through the ashes of countless pyres, through the screams that once echoed in public squares, and through the records of trials where justice wore the mask of terror. The witch hunts weren't merely episodes of religious fervor. They were systematic campaigns of gender-based violence, cloaked in the language of divine righteousness and social protection. Between 40 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft during this dark period, and historians estimate that 75 to 80% of them were women. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were the manifestation of deep-seated misogyny, economic anxieties, and the fatal combination of superstition with institutional power. Before we descend into the specific horrors these women endured, we must understand the machinery of accusation that fed the trials. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer provided a pseudo-legal and theological framework for identifying, prosecuting, and executing suspected witches. This infamous text declared that women were more susceptible to demonic influence due to their allegedly weaker nature and carnal lust. It wasn't just a book, it was a manual for misogyny, providing interrogation techniques, torture protocols, and legal justifications for the systematic persecution of women. The profile of a typical witch trial victim reveals the true nature of these persecutions. She was often elderly, widowed, and poor, a woman without male protection in a rigidly patriarchal society. She might have been a healer with knowledge of herbs, a midwife who attended difficult births, or simply a woman who spoke too freely or refused to conform to expected behavior. Economic factors played a crucial role. In Germanic regions, property seizure was legal after conviction, creating financial incentives for accusations. Neighbors could acquire land, settle debts, or eliminate competition by crying witch. Social tensions needed scapegoats, crop failures, livestock deaths, or unexplained illnesses demanded someone to blame, and vulnerable women fit the role perfectly. The accusation itself was a death sentence in slow motion. Once named, a woman entered a labyrinth from which few emerged alive. The trial process was designed not to establish innocence, but to extract confession through systematic torture. And the tortures were where human imagination turned truly monstrous. The swimming test, also known as ordeal by water, was one of the most perversely logical methods used to determine guilt. This trial by ordeal operated on a theological paradox that sealed the accused woman's fate before she ever touched the water. The process was brutally simple. The accused woman was bound in a specific way: right thumb tied to left big toe, left thumb to right big toe, creating a cross-like position believed to invoke divine judgment. She was stripped to her undergarments, ostensibly to remove any charms or magical objects, but in reality to add humiliation to the ordeal. A rope was tied around her waist, and she was thrown or lowered into a body of water, a pond, river, or specially constructed pit. The theological reasoning was chillingly circular. Pure water, blessed by God, would reject an evil witch, causing her to float. An innocent woman, accepted by the pure water, would sink, but here lies the fatal trap. If she floated, she was deemed guilty and faced execution, usually by burning. If she sank, proving her innocence, she often drowned before she could be pulled up or suffered such trauma that she died shortly after. The rope was sometimes deliberately given slack, ensuring that proof of innocence came at the cost of life itself. The case of Mary Sutton in 1612 Bedford, England, exemplifies this horror. Contemporary records note that she was swum multiple times, and though she repeatedly sank, which should have proven her innocence, the examiners declared that she had used witchcraft to make herself sink. She was executed anyway. The swimming test wasn't just about determining guilt. It was public spectacle, a form of entertainment that reinforced community bonds through collective participation in violence. Crowds would gather, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, to watch these ordeals. The psychological torture of being dragged before your neighbors, stripped, bound, and thrown into water while they cheered or jeered cannot be overstated. Even more insidious was the search for the devil's mark, an allegedly supernatural blemish where the accused had supposedly sealed her pact with Satan. This practice combined invasive physical examination with pseudoscience, transforming normal human bodies into evidence of evil. Professional witch prickers emerged across Scotland and England, men who claimed expertise in identifying these marks. They were paid per conviction, creating a perverse financial incentive for finding evidence. Matthew Hopkins, England's self-proclaimed witch finder general, employed teams of women to strip search accused witches, looking for any blemish, birthmark, mole, or scar that could be deemed supernatural. The examination process was itself a form of torture. Women were stripped naked and every inch of their body scrutinized by strangers. Their hair was shaved to reveal any hidden marks. They were forced to stand while multiple examiners probed their skin with pins, needles, and specially designed bodkins, sharp instruments that could be pressed deeply into the flesh. The test relied on a simple but fatally flawed principle. The devil's mark would not bleed or feel pain when pierced. In reality, prickers often used retractable needles, instruments where the blade withdrew into the handle upon pressure, creating the illusion of penetration without actually piercing the skin. This theatrical deception proved the presence of insensate spots, condemning innocent women. But even when genuine needles were used, they could exploit natural physiology. Scar tissue, moles, and birthmarks often have reduced sensation. A woman in shock, terrified and humiliated, might not react to pain in expected ways. Examiners would prick repeatedly until they found a spot with reduced sensation or bleeding, then declare it supernatural. Every natural variation in skin, every blemish that makes us human, could become evidence of evil. It transformed the intimate and personal into the public and damning. If these women's stories deserve to be remembered, if you believe that understanding history's darkest chapters helps prevent their repetition, hit that subscribe button. These weren't nameless victims. They were mothers, healers, neighbors, and friends whose suffering was systematically documented by those who destroyed them. Their voices deserve witnesses across the centuries. Now let's continue into the psychological warfare that broke spirits without leaving visible scars. Not all torture left marks on the body. Sleep deprivation, euphemistically called waking the witch, was a psychological torture technique that could break the strongest spirit without leaving evidence that might trouble conscience-stricken witnesses. This method understood something fundamental about human vulnerability. The mind, when deprived of rest, becomes its own torturer. The process was methodical. The accused was prevented from sleeping for days, sometimes exceeding a week. Whenever she began to doze, guards or appointed watchers would physically rouse her, shaking her, walking her around the cell, or causing her pain. The Scottish practice involved forcing the accused to walk continuously for 24 to 48 hours, hence the term walking the witch. Matthew Hopkins documented this technique extensively. He wrote that witches must be kept from sleep because during sleep their familiar spirits, demons in animal form, would come to suckle at their devil's marks. By preventing sleep, he claimed he could both gather evidence by catching these familiars and weaken the witch's resistance to confession. The reality was far more sinister. Modern sleep research has shown that after 72 hours without sleep, the human brain begins to hallucinate. Victims would see things that weren't there, hear voices, lose track of time and reality. In this fractured mental state, they would confess to anything, flying through the night sky, transforming into animals, attending Sabbaths with the devil himself. These confessions, extracted through psychological torture, were then used as evidence against others, spreading accusations like plague through entire communities. Perhaps most disturbing were the watchers themselves. Often local women hired to prevent the accused from sleeping. These watchers were sometimes neighbors or even former friends of the accused, paid a small fee to participate in this torture. The witch trials didn't just punish the accused. They corrupted entire communities, turning neighbor against neighbor, forcing ordinary people to become instruments of suffering. In Scotland, the practice was even more brutal. The accused might be placed in the witch's bridle or scold's bridle, a metal cage around the head with a spiked plate forcing the tongue down while being kept awake. This dual torture prevented both sleep and speech, isolating the victim in a prison of exhaustion and pain. Sleep deprivation represents psychological warfare at its most calculated. It doesn't merely break the body. It fractures reality itself, transforming the victim's own mind into an interrogation chamber from which there is no escape. When confession finally came, as it almost always did, it emerged not from guilt, but from a mind so shattered that death seemed preferable to another moment of consciousness. And death, when it came, often arrived through the most theatrical and terrifying method of all. Of all the punishments inflicted on accused witches, none captures the imagination and horror quite like burning at the stake. This method of execution, favored particularly in continental Europe and Scotland, was chosen not merely for its lethality but for its symbolic weight. Fire was believed to purify, to cleanse the community of evil, and to serve as a visible warning to others who might stray from acceptable behavior. The process began with the construction of the pyre, a platform of wood and combustible materials built in a public square or field. The accused was brought forth, often after days of torture and imprisonment, weakened and terrified. In many cases, she would be forced to wear a special garment, a shift soaked in sulfur or pitch to ensure the flames would catch quickly. She was then bound to the stake, sometimes sitting on a small platform, sometimes standing, sometimes suspended slightly above the ground. In some places, a small bag of gunpowder would be tied around the victim's neck as a gesture of mercy. The explosion would kill quickly before the flames reached the body, but mercy was rarely the goal. The burning of witches was theater, a public demonstration of authority and divine justice. Crowds numbered in the hundreds or thousands. People would travel from neighboring villages to witness the spectacle. Children were brought to learn the consequences of evil. The condemned would often be forced to make a final confession or proclamation, another chance for authority to extract submission even at the moment of death. In the German city of Würzburg, between 1626 and 1631, approximately 900 people were burned at the stake during the height of the witch trials. Among them were children, as young as 7 years old, accused alongside their mothers. The Würzburg trials left detailed records that give us a horrifying window into the scale of these executions. One document lists 29 burnings in a single session, with multiple victims burned simultaneously to save wood and time. The list includes entries like the wife of the baker, the daughter of Dr. Brown, the fairest maid in Würzburg, reducing human beings to brief descriptors before their deaths. The physical reality of burning was more horrific than most imagine. Death by fire is not instantaneous. Smoke inhalation might cause unconsciousness before the flames reached the body, but if the wind blew the wrong way or the fire built slowly, the victim could remain conscious through minutes of unimaginable agony. The smell of burning flesh, the sounds of screaming, these were the sensory experiences that communities gathered to witness. The ashes and remains were often scattered or disposed of in rivers to prevent any possibility of the witch returning or her remains becoming objects of sympathy or reverence. Even in death there was to be no dignity, no memorial, no acknowledgement of humanity. The witch hunts finally began to decline in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, not because humanity suddenly became more enlightened, but because the intellectual foundations of the trials began to crumble. Physicians started questioning the reality of devil's marks. Legal scholars criticized the use of torture to extract confessions. Religious reformers argued that obsession with witchcraft distracted from genuine faith. But the end came too late for the tens of thousands who had already perished. The last execution for witchcraft in the British Isles occurred in 1727 when Janet Horne, an elderly woman with cognitive impairment, was stripped, covered in tar, and burned alive in Dornoch, Scotland. She was accused of transforming her daughter into a pony and having her shod by the devil. The absurdity of the charge highlights how divorced from reality these trials had become. What the witch hunts reveal about human nature is deeply uncomfortable. They show how easily fear can be weaponized, how quickly communities can turn on their most vulnerable members, and how systems of oppression disguise themselves as justice. The women who died weren't witches, they were scapegoats, sacrificed to anxieties about religious change, economic instability, and the threat of female independence. Their real crime was being powerless in a world that demanded submission, and their punishment was designed to ensure that every other woman understood the consequences of stepping outside prescribed boundaries. The flames may have gone out centuries ago, but the lessons remain urgent. When we allow fear to override reason, when we transform the different into the dangerous, when we build systems that punish the vulnerable to comfort the powerful, we walk the same path that led to those pyres. How do you think fear and social anxiety contribute to the persecution of vulnerable groups today? Share your thoughts in the comments below.